Hello, and welcome to a new episode of OTT Talks. I'm Enrique Mendizabal, OTT founder and director. OTT Talks is a series of friendly conversations with thought leaders and practitioners in the field of evidence-informed policymaking. In today's episode, we will talk with David Sasaki, Program Officer in the Gender Equity and Governance Program at the Hewlett Foundation. David has also been Program Officer at the Gates Foundation. Before Gates, he worked at the Omidyar Network, developing its government transparency portfolio in Latin America. And he has also worked as a consultant for the Open Society Foundations. It is fitting, therefore, to start a new series of OTT Talks with Program Officers at the Foundations with David. Through this series, we want to explore and learn more about this role and the people behind it. They are, after all, responsible for funding the projects, organizations, and crucially, the people that OTT's community is most concerned about. David, welcome. We're very happy to have you here. And let me start from the beginning. How did you become Program Officer at the Hewlett Foundation, or how did you become Program Officer, period?
Thanks for having me, Enrique. I always enjoy our conversations, learn something from you every single time, and I'm sure that will be true today too. I do have one favor to ask you. There's so much criticism of philanthropy these days and foundation in being largely unaccountable. And I think that is a fair critique. And I listen to a couple of podcasts and video series where they interview program officers and folks who work at foundations. And I feel like they could be a little bit more hard hitting. So the favor that I ask you is to hold us accountable in these series, including me today. So how did I come to be a program officer at Hewlett Foundation? I guess I have to go back a little bit into how I started working in philanthropy at all at Open Society Foundations. So from around 2005 to 2010, I was working for a nonprofit media organization called Global Voices. And quite a large part of my job was serving as a re-granter. We got funding from the Knight Foundation originally, then from MacArthur and Open Society Foundations. And a lot of the money that we received then went out to other community groups through microgrants to fund their own narrative storytelling about what they were experiencing in the world. So this was back in 2007. This was around the launch of the One Laptop per Child project in Uruguay. Okay. There was a lot of conversation and debate happening in the American press, a lot of information coming out of MIT, very little information coming from people who were actually implementing the project in Uruguay itself. So we gave a grant to a couple of library groups and civil society groups that were supporting that process so that they could narrate what was it like to receive hundreds of thousands of laptops and distribute them to schools. That's just one type of example. As I was doing the proposal writing and the report writing, I experienced what many of us experience as we do this, which is just kind of scratching my head at the way that foundations worked at the time. And I think largely continue to work. Given the new technologies and some of the new norms, it seemed very old school to me, not agile at all. It was a lot around foundations kind of telling us what they thought we should be doing according to their strategy. It was fairly bureaucratic. It wasn't that trusting. It was based a lot on talking, less on listening. And just the amount of time that went into sending these long PDF reports rather than being able to share on a weekly basis in a more, lighthearted and agile fashion of what we were up to struck me as not relevant for the time. So on one of my meetings with a program officer at Open Society Foundations, I kind of, offered some critique and frustration about how things were going. And she mentioned that a position was opening up at the foundation. Right. And if I was interested or thought that I could do any better, then, I should give it a shot.
Challenge.
Exactly. I didn't know that it was right for me, but I thought it was a good exercise to try to send in a letter of interest and my resume and see how that would go. That was in 2010 when I started working at Open Society Foundations. And philanthropy has just grown so quickly since then that opportunities came up that I found to be very compelling. So that's how I started working at Omidyar Network, which then spun off to become Luminate. They were just launching a new strategy for Latin America and wanted someone to take over that work. And Gates Foundation was growing very quickly, so that opportunity arose. Hewlett Foundation was a little bit different. Hewlett Foundation was, I always thought, a exemplar in philanthropy and was the foundation that I would point to most often at the other places where I was working about, why don't we work a little bit more the way that they are? And when I was at Gates Foundation, I started a fellowship at Institute for the Future, thinking about the trends of the Giving Pledge and just how much money was being committed, pledged, not necessarily being dispersed, but being pledged to philanthropy, and what the implications of that would be over the next 10 to 20 years. So it was a way for me to step out of my day-to-day job at Gates Foundation, which I was finding a little bit frustrating at the time, and think in a more panoramic scale of the broader sector. One of the people who I've always respected a lot, I know it's a shared source of admiration for us, is Ruth Levine, who was leading the Global Development Population Program at Hewlett Foundation at the time. So I asked her to be an advisor on that project.
Right.
And when a position opened up in that program at Hewlett Foundation, she talked to me about it. And it seemed like a chance. I was already, I think, not sure if I wanted to continue in philanthropy, having worked at 3 foundations before this. But what convinced me is I thought, here's a place where I'm not going to be pushing back against the protocols and ways of working of a foundation. And instead, here's a place that has the vision and processes in place that I really support. And I think that I could try to thrive in and actually implement a vision of grant making. And that's exactly what I've been able to do over the 7 years. So I'm very grateful to Ruth and to Hewlett Foundation for the opportunity.
So, so before you tell me a little bit about the role involved, so the program officer role involves, you're describing something interesting. So it's my impression that the field of philanthropy is, one where people move around quite a lot, from foundation to foundation through these contacts, these invitations to, tap on the shoulder, hey, you could do some work with us. Is that a fair description of this world that for many grantees, many organizations seems often so far away, so detached from what they do, right? There's a question: how do I get in? How do I get to know these people a little bit more?
Yeah, I think from the outside, it probably seems like they're secret networks within philanthropy, and we only work with each other and we try to exclude everyone else. I think it's more innocuous how these things take shape. I think oftentimes we come into these positions with a great deal of imposter syndrome, like, whoa, how did I get this job?
Yeah.
Why am I in control of this budget? And I really need the support of other people at other foundations to try to figure out, like, what am I supposed to do? How do I deal with these awkward situations? And then networks do come out about that, and I think that is how a lot of people get jobs. I've always thought from the very beginning, since I first received a grant from Knight Foundation, that the best way to predict how a new program officer is likely going to implement a grant making strategy is not by looking at the strategy itself, but by that person's LinkedIn network going into the job. I think existing relationships are obviously very important. There's the old saying that social change moves as fast as trust, and trust is established over years. And so I think a lot of those trusting relationships take shape before the program officer arrives in the position. So yeah, those networks are important.
So what does the program officer do? From what you're saying, it's not just about dispersing money; it's building networks, making connections. What else? How would you describe your role?
It's so hard to generalize. The way that I would do it is if you think about an Excel spreadsheet and you have the first column going down, any program officer, unless you're starting a new program from scratch, which when I came to Omidyar Network, there were no grantees in Latin America. So they asked me to build something from scratch. But mostly there are existing grantees that you are going to inherit as a program officer when you come on board. So that first column, you can think of list the organizations that are currently being funded. And then in the first row, think about all of the years that you're going to be working at that foundation. So I started working at Hewlett Foundation, I think in 2015. So 2015, there was a certain budget. I think it was around $30 million. And then you can just go down the column and see how that $30 million was allocated across all of these different organizations. The way that I think about a program officer is over a period of time. At Hewlett Foundation, it's 8 years because we have 8-year terms. You have to decide of that column of organizations, which ones you phase out over time and say that you're going to stop funding them, which ones you increase their funding, which ones you reduce their funding as the years go by, and then which new organizations you add to that portfolio. So I very much have a portfolio mindset of how a program officer does this. I think a lot of program officers think about it in terms of their strategy and their impact and their outcomes. But for me, each organization that we fund they have their own strategy. They have their own outcomes that we're working toward. And so I really try to think of my job as being kind of an investor in service to the strategies that they're trying to implement.
So an investor rather than an activist to some extent. I mean, I get the feeling recently, I have a feeling a lot of the foundations we've been engaging with and working with, or keep an eye out for, are taking on a much more activist role. So they almost doing the job that their grantees used to do, right? Like I think it used to be more like what you're describing, just give money to an organization that takes on the government. But now it seems like more foundations are trying to take on the government as well, with more resources, and often before their grantees, have a chance to do it. Is the role of the PO or the program officer changing?
It depends on the foundation. I have a point of view on this. I think it makes sense for the civil society organization to be the locus, the decider of what is good strategy. They're closest to all of these actors, and foundations and the funders tend to operate at least 1 degree or 2 degrees of separation. Most of the information we get about the world is not from firsthand source contacts, but is from other people at other foundations that we talk about, or the executive directors of organizations that we fund. So I don't think it makes sense for foundations to be the activist, to say, here is the campaign that 10 different organizations should all get behind. And in my experience, a lot of the organizations deep down, they'll get in line with a funder and they'll support that funder's talking points in order to get the funding. But I think that it causes a lot of resentment. The trade-off is that sometimes you need a leader to try to create, to get a coalition. It's very difficult to facilitate a coalition to be working toward a common cause, while funding all of those different organizations and hoping that they're going to work together collaboratively. Whereas if a funder says, look, this is what we're doing, we'll fund you if you follow us or not, that's obviously an easier way to go about it.
So what kind of skills, what kind of skills do you need for your job? Besides being good at budgeting, I guess. What other things you need to do well to keep an eye out for the portfolio, as you say, facilitate the coalition building process or cohesion building process?
Yeah, I think a journalistic set of skills is really valuable. Being able to know just enough to ask really good questions of organizations about their strategies, but not so much that you're trying to micromanage them. Not so much that you think that you know the answer better than they do, but you know the really good questions to ask. And like a good journalist, you're able to draw associations and links between what different organizations and actors are doing. So, one thing that every program officer finds very soon into her or his tenure is that a number of organizations are working on common activities or working towards similar goals. And maybe they have slightly different approaches, but someone needs to help facilitate, help play the role of seeing where there's duplication and where things could be more efficient if people were to work together. And I try not to be too heavy-handed about that and say, look, this other organization is doing this set of activities. I think they're better than you, and you should do this instead. But rather just facilitate the conversations to see where does it make sense for each organization to be specializing. Beyond skills, in terms of, finding associations, speaking with a lot of people to understand different points of views about an intervention. I think there's also a sensibility that's really important for program officers, and this goes back to your previous question, I think not trying to take the lead about what ought to be done, but supporting other leaders and trying to be really responsive to understand the human elements of an organization. So often we focus on the strategy, on the how can you achieve some particular outcome, but just the well-being of the staff, the psychological well-being of the executive director, the relationship between the board and the oversight governance functions. All of those things are just as important as the strategy. If an organization effective isn't the right word, but isn't in a good place energy-wise, doesn't have that momentum, doesn't have the desire to be doing the work that they want to do, it's not going to be successful.
Is the thing about empathy or kind of connection to your grantees or to the world of your the people working in the portfolio? You see a lot of foundations that they have a particular profile, sort of McKinsey type profile. Everybody has gone through business degrees or come from the private sector, and they're very efficient, very data driven. Others, they seem to be attracting people who come from grassroots or from the organizations that the foundation tends to fund. Right? So, is there a pro and a con to any of those profiles?
I wouldn't say to the profile. What I would say is you want the
The
most
experience, the background.
accurate. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really good to have the analytical skills of being able to look at a budget or spending and say, how is this organization allocating its resources? If the goal is to empower grassroots communities and 60% of the budget is going to operations in like a very wealthy neighborhood in a capital city, then that's a conversation that needs to happen. So being able to analyze the numbers for sure matters. Also, just looking at like how much does this cost, the cost effectiveness of their work, and is one organization more cost effective than another is really important. But for me, it's about having candid conversations. There's a lot of performance in our sector. It's like every time I travel anywhere and do my, it's 4 or 5 meetings with local civil society organizations every day, and you get the pitch, and it's a really nice looking presentation. Go through it, and it's kind of like the performance is to demonstrate how smart every person is, how good their political read is. They have a great looking website, but then you need to get beyond that kind of establishing status, establishing authority, and have the conversation about what are you struggling with? Like, so you have been working on this problem for 10 years, and we've hit a lot of bumps in the road. We haven't maybe seen the amount of advancement that we had been hoping for. So what are we learning? How are we adjusting? What are the problems? And once you're able to have a true, honest conversation about what's not working as much as what is, I find that that's the type of grant-making relationship that becomes much more responsive to the environment.
How do you get past this? And I was going to ask you a question about power asymmetries. I think this relates to this performance that takes place. And there's a lot of pretend. But I have a feeling sometimes it's both sides, right? There's a pretend on the side of the potential grantee or the grantee about how well we do things. In the world of think tanks, there's a lot of pretend in terms of the impact that think tanks have. They do have impact, but not as much as think tanks tend to say they have. But I think sometimes on the side of the funder, right, about their practice, about the trust they have on the grantees or potential grantees. How do you get past this and get to a point where you can really have an honest conversation with between people, between individuals, and you recognize that someone is asking you, you've got money, and somebody's asking you for that money, and you've got money, and you got to decide whether they're worth that money. Even if it's all yours, but it's the money you're responsible for.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely try to get away from any language about worth, and tying work, because I think that's such a big part of it. I think that a lot of executive directors, I think that some boards judge the value of the executive director or the person's performance based on just how much money they're able to bring in. Yeah. Whereas ideally, the focus is on who are you trying to serve, toward what mission, and are you getting there or not? And if that's the focus, ideally the foundation see that and will fund the work because it makes sense to. But oftentimes it goes the other way. So, to answer your question, the way that I try to do this is just by recognizing my own failures as much as possible, and by asking questions based on what I've learned in my experience of having made many different mistakes. So I've made a number of mistakes about being way too hands-off during leadership transitions of grantee organizations, where they've actually wanted more involvement from me and from other funders to say, this is a really important moment and we need more input on this. And I felt like I was too imposing, and I didn't want to have any sort of influence over who the next executive director would be. So I talk about, if right now there are a couple of organizations in our portfolio that are going through leadership transitions, and I just try to start those conversations from a point of, here's what I've learned in the past. I don't know that I know how to do it now, but let's have a back and forth. And I feel that when people hear me recognize my mistakes, that's maybe an invitation for us to have a more honest conversation.
To have a discussion. I try to do the same, but I've always used when I was working a lot in Africa, when I started my work in international development, I would start by talking about the challenges Peru faced after 200 years of independence. And it's, the room opened up, right? Because I wasn't there lecturing anybody about, how the Brits do it so great or the Americans do it so great. I was struggling with, my own national problems, just like them. And so it brings down the guard, right? Your guard is down. And so I think people can open up a little bit more.
And that's a much, I mean, I think you doing that is much more impressive and courageous than any program officer, because there's this inherent power dynamic. It's a great privilege to be able to talk about all of your failures, because you are coming from a position of like perceived status and power just by having control of grant making budget. It'll be interesting, once I'm no longer in philanthropy anymore, am I like so forthcoming in all of the mistakes that I make, or do I feel like I need to hide those a little bit because I'm seeking fundraising or whatever it might be?
Let me stay a little bit of this world of more kind of personal questions, and here's something I've been thinking about. So your funding keeps many people employed, right? It in some extent allows them to live a comfortable life. In some cases, it keeps them physically safe. In some cases, right? Because working in certain organizations is a lifeline for people in certain contexts. In other cases, it empowers individuals or organizations vis-a-vis their peers. Your funding maybe you didn't plan for this, but may legitimize someone, within their context or their organization, their ideology, or the opposite, right? It actually might affect them. In some cases, being associated to some funders can undermine individual efforts. There are some of the more campaigning funders are, unintentionally, I think, creating some problems for their grantees. But in essence, I feel that foundations and program officers are making decisions that affect the lives, right, personal and professional, of a lot of people, let alone the ultimate beneficiaries that you are trying to support. And I wonder, and let alone the fact that you are controlling a lot of money, and I sort of think about the budgets some foundations that we work with have. I sort of think, what would I do if I had that money, right? So it's a bit of feeling of what would I do? I don't know. But does this have an effect on you as a person? And what kind of effect does it have?
Oh, definitely. I mean, in many different ways. It's hard for me to trust conversations with anyone, to fully trust a conversation and intent with anyone who is in a fundraising position, which is a terrible thing. But
it's like, is he my friend? Is this email friendly email, or are we going to get a pitch in a couple of minutes?
Not even that. I mean, I feel that I'm very fortunate, and it's very important for program officers to have friends outside of their professional networks, because if not, you're not getting. We all need friends. We all need people to be able to vent to. But there are, I think, some program staff who really don't have those friendship networks outside of the professional networks, or they're very mixed. For a time when I was living in Mexico City, they were incredibly mixed, and it almost led to a full-on identity crisis of like, well, just what you said. Is this person my friend because they really want to be my friend, or is this a way where they're expecting to get funding for their organization, for themselves? I don't have to worry about that, but you are absolutely right. At the beginning, you said your funding decisions. And so one thing I want to recognize is that I'm just one part of a long chain of how money gets allocated, from the investment team of the Hewlett Foundation, who invests the endowment, to the president and board of the foundation, who allocates it across the different programs, to the program director, who then allocates it across the different strategies. And then I'm one of 3 program officers who decides how that strategy budget is going to be allocated across countries. And then within countries, there are pairs of us who decide which organizations they go to. We then fund organizations with fairly large grants compared to some of our peer funders. So many of our grants are like $1 to $2 million. Those grants are often too large for the organization receiving the grant. So they then contract out to partner organizations working in other places. And sometimes they contract out. By the time it gets to the person who's actually doing the work, a lot of people like me have taken a cut of it to our paycheck,
Yeah.
right, to make the decisions about who ultimately gets it. With that said, program officers of foundations do have a lot of agency in shaping where that money goes to. And, often when I look at the financial budgets that come in, most of the money goes to salary, either to full-time salary or to contractors. And so I really think a lot about philanthropy in terms of subsidizing somebody's time so that that time doesn't have to be compensated by either the public sector or the private sector. It's compensated by a third source so that it can be used towards something that is hopefully more experimental, a longer time horizon, something that wouldn't be covered by the government or the private sector to do good in the world. Whose time it is and how much they're compensated for that time is something that I don't think is discussed nearly enough in our sector. And I think that we're going to go through a reckoning in the coming years of salary equity in civil society, but also across countries for those of us who do international work.
But are you so this is about the money itself, right? But what about the impact you have on people, on organizations? Is it something that sort of weighs on you? Is this a sense of responsibility sometimes with individuals you've been supporting over the years? Like, that list you talked about, the first column, where you've got to decide who gets cut, right? Your portfolio has different interests. As you said, somebody higher up in the chain is made some decisions about budget allocation, and you have to make those decisions.
This is where we don't get the feedback that we need to get as program officers. So the feedback that we get is typically from the people that we fund, and they tell us that we're the best and we're making the best decisions because we're giving them money. And we don't get feedback from those that we don't fund because they still have hope that they're going to get funding down the road. Nobody's really telling us like you're making the wrong decision here. And they are important decisions in terms of whose work is endorsed, who gets a higher profile within a field. And then in addition to the funding, sometimes I think we do develop favorites. There are certain organizations that we find very impactful. And so we make connections between them and maybe a prestigious university or some media organization if a journalist asks us for a recommendation. All of those have weight, and how much faith we can, or how much confidence we can have in the endorsements that we make, I think we should be pretty humble about that.
And so you described something very interesting because it's very far from the typical logical framework. As you said at the beginning, a clear objective, and everything lines up to that objective. There's a lot of relationship involved, a lot of emotion involved. There's a lot of uncharted territory in the way you develop and sustain your portfolio. How do you measure success, or how do you know in formal terms that you're doing all right, you're doing well, you're kind of fulfilling your part of the mission, and also how do you personally feel satisfied? What are you most proud of? What are you most satisfied about the work you've done as a program officer?
Well, in terms of formal terms, I mean, you know this answer well because you worked on this with us on think tanks. So in formal terms, every 5 years, we refresh the strategy. Every 5 years, we commission an evaluation to try to understand what was accomplished and what wasn't, and what we've learned from the past 5 years of strategy implementation. And we commission an outside group to do that so that there's some independence. They go and ask the various players what can be learned. And we worked on think tanks for the evaluation of, and Southern Voice,
Southern Hemisphere and OTT.
Southern Hemisphere, yeah, on that evaluation. So we learned a lot from that work, but as you experienced and as we experienced, when you fund more than 100 organizations, there's no one objective that you're working toward. At the time, we were working toward more transparent, participatory, and accountable government across the world. And I don't think we can say we got there or we didn't get there. And so, when do I experience moments of learning and of assessment of progress, oftentimes it's just from reading the newspaper. I mean, a lot of it is in conversations with grantee organizations or with maybe journalists who follow their work or policymakers who work in that country and have been informed by their work. But this change happened so slowly over time. During the Independence Day speech of the Kenyan president, what was it, 2 days ago, he talked about the need for more recognition of an excluded tribe on the coast of Kenya. And we've given a lot of support to Nubian Rights Forum, working with Namati and others to work on a more inclusive view of citizenship in Kenya. So when I read something like that as a commemoration of Independence Day in Kenya, that feels good. It wasn't directly linked to our work, but we were one of many, many funders and actors contributing to this larger idea that citizenship is important. Statelessness is something that we ought to address. And I think we're making progress on that. So that feels good.
Right. It's a collection of stories that add up to a sense of whether we're moving in the right direction or not, actually. And even if we're not moving in the right direction, it might be that it's just temporarily, and the story hasn't ended with the project cycle. Let me ask you one final.
Can I just say briefly that part of this is unique to the area that we're working in, which is in equity, inclusion, and democracy. I would say are kind of three of the big areas. And that's always going to be ongoing work. There's no destination there. That's not dam removal where you're like, oh, we have 50 dams in a certain country and we're trying to remove them, and have we gotten there or not? It's not vaccine delivery. There are some programs and some goals that lend themselves much more to quantified metrics. And democracy and power dynamics between various demographic groups, it's not. It's always going to be messy.
Do you wish you were working in that less messier field where you could, at the end of the year, say, yeah, done, check. We removed so many dams. We provided so many vaccines. Or is this really, is this where your passion is? The messier, more complex, uncertain field of governance and democracy.
I mean, by personality type, I'm not drawn to messy. It's not where I want to go. I mean, I think it'd be great to work on something that's a little bit easier to measure. But I think at the foundation of all of the easier to measure interventions, like how much malaria, how many cases of malaria are there, and how does that link to how many bed nets have gone out? They are political questions that are at the foundation of all of those things.
Exactly.
Polio is still around, not because of any sort of lack of innovation in vaccines. It's because of political dynamics. And it's because of resentments of a central government feeling like these marginalized groups in Pakistan and Nigeria and other places are not getting the recognition of the resources that they ought to. So I just don't think that you can fully address the easier to measure interventions without doing this kind of core work of democracy and the people work.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that thought. David, thank you very much for joining us for this episode of OTT Talks. It was a fascinating and insightful conversation as ever, and I could talk about this for hours. We will be back with more conversations with thought leaders and practitioners in the field of evidence-informed policymaking. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or your preferred podcast service for new episodes. And do sign up to our newsletter in the blurb for this OTT Talks to receive the latest updates from across OTT directly to your inbox. And again, thank you very much, David, and I'll see you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Enrique.
Thank you.